St. Patrick's Day, this is when I break out the my one Iowa green sweatshirt that my mom got me when I got into the university, however many years ago now, more than 10 years ago at this point. So I think about 80% of the time that I've worn it has been on St. Patrick's Day, which today is. So that's why we're breaking it out again. So again, University of Iowa,
There you go.
showing that in. I think we're a sixth seed in the women's tournament. Miss Caitlin Clark a lot. But we want to focus on tariffs today. Um, we're seeing maybe a little bit of a scaling back in the tariff threats from what we had seen before. But and with this rebounding stock market today and what happened at the end of last week, Tim, starting with you, I mean, is this now, assuming that the stock market continues to rebound, you eventually get back up to where it was at one point with people's 401ks in that recovery mode, and maybe prices not going quite as up at the grocery stores? Was this ending up looking like a good move or a bunch of hullabaloo about nothing at the end of the day?
Well, we'll see in November of 2026, right? I mean, there's a long tail or a longer tail to this, and we all know with our 401ks and investing, there's ups and there's downs, and you have to kind of look at it over the long term. And that's kind of, I think, the phase that we're in right now. One of the big things, I think, for business in general, both American business and international business, is certainty, right? That's what business likes, is certainty and some stability. And so if the Trump administration can get a little bit more stability and kind of the business community feels kind of okay, this is where the administration is going with tariffs or not tariffs, then they can play to those rules. But until they really know what those rules are going to be, you'll find that things are a little bit more volatile and business gets a bit nervous with that. So I think they're just from the business standpoint is saying, let us know what the rules are, what the tariffs are going to be, how long they're going to be, in place, what might be the protocol for getting them lifted, and we can adjust with whatever that is. We just need to know what the policy and what the rules are for at least the near and even the midterm.
Tal, you agree with that? I mean, we spoke with you last week about this, right at probably the apex of how far down it got from the stock market, and now we're seeing a bit of recovery since. Is that a good assessment?
Yeah, I think we're taking part in a national conversation about trade policy, right? So there's lots of folks in our country, and I think many of them um, have every right to be frustrated or concerned that the last, 20 or 30 years, they've not seen the same success that many large businesses in our country have, right? And a good part of that is because we've had access to very inexpensive goods, things like this god awful shirt I'm wearing today, right? Like there are things like fast fat.
We didn't say it
Go
was
ahead.
god awful. We were just surprised that you're wearing it in a rainstorm.
That's fair. Well, I was trying to just like what would Rain want to show up, and I figured a more tropical setting would make sense here in the heart of the San Joaquin Valley. Um, this shirt, which maybe cost me $20, that's in some sense been subsidized by the offshoring of manufacturing jobs in the United States, and cotton is actually one of the more poignant examples of that. So again, the conversation we're having right now is not just steel, not just semiconductors, but all of the goods that we spend a lot of money on. The idea is like fast fashion or, like I've mentioned before, Tupperwares and things like that, things you used to have as a consumer for a number of years that you may buy every couple of months now because it's so cheap. That's going to be called into question. But part of that equation is also that bringing this manufacturing into our country may create some of the middle class jobs that we've seen go away and that you've seen really in the part of the state where we live, and then also in the Midwest. I mean, there were factories, there were Americans that would make goods for Americans, some of which would even then be sold overseas as well. But that's the conversation that's taking place right now. Our goods may get more expensive, but we're going to have a conversation around where these things are coming from and who's actually paying the bill and how.
And when we think about California, Tal, just into this equation as well, number one, you're already going to have a number of amplified anti-Trump voices that are going to be making their conversation heard about this, especially as so many people pointed to Trump being the person who they respect more on the economy going into this last election, they viewed more favorably than Kamala Harris. And I guess the second part to that, too, is when you actually see that in the grocery store, prices
Mhm.
for inflation were starting to come down in that last year. Of course, too slowly for the people of the United States, but maybe for folks in California, if they start to see that rise and that increase again, that's why it gets
Yeah.
that conversation gets louder here, right?
Well, I've found that any politician not currently in charge takes great interest in the costs of goods that have gone up until they become in power. And then all of a sudden, it's the opposition that is now concerned, whether it's the price of eggs, the price of gas at any given moment, our energy prices, any number of things like that. One thing that I do find ironic is that the focus on the stock market and the support for free trade is a fairly recent progressive phenomenon. So for decades, they've raised concerns around workplace treatment, human rights concerns, and certainly environmental concerns as we've offshored jobs to countries that the three of us don't spend any time thinking about unless we happen to look at the tag on something we bought. That's completely gone away. And equally, I think as interesting is the fact that the free trade discussion, for the most part, which was, one of the legs of the conservative stool, has straight up disappeared. Like it's like it never existed. Like that wasn't the second or third thing that a conservative would spout nearly immediately in any conversation. So it's really interesting that we've seen that the sort of changing of the guard on this particular issue. And now it'll be on the American people, as Tim mentioned, come next election to determine who they're going to reward based on this change in policy if it in fact sticks around for the next several months.
Yeah, Tim, your thoughts on that too?
Well, no, I agree. I think that, really the thrust of it is that going back to the electorate, right? Voters, how they feel at their kitchen table on any of these issues. I mean, we can talk, and I think Republicans are always guilty of talking about this grand economic theory. Democrats, to some degree, get into those kind of grand economic theories more so. Sal said, recently this phenomenon talking about, free markets and that type of thing. But what it comes down to is how is this all being interpreted and felt by, a family in the Central Valley who is a middle income family with, two or three kids who are working, working a job, and maybe you've got one parent, two parent, working a job, and kind of what their day-to-day reality is in terms of, going to the grocery store and, purchasing, all types of goods and services, the cost of a car, what their insurance prices are looking like. All of those things. They're not going to differentiate, well, this is, happening because the Trump administration did this, or this is happening because they're going to be looking at it kind of from a holistic view of, if it's not working, it's everybody's fault. If it's working, well, then what they're doing is fantastic, and that's really, I think, what is going to be a big driving factor in November 2026.
And Tim, something else interesting too, right, is the power change with Carney coming in as prime minister, replacing Justin Trudeau. And even though Sheinbaum's technically from Mexico has been in the role for longer than Trump
Yeah.
has in this particular capacity, Trump's been around for what, 10, 12 years at this point in this particular role and
Yeah.
being seen on the national stage in the way that he is. So what role does, let me set the tone for this relationship have in some of the policy that we've seen so far? And I think maybe even harkening back to the old border wall policy where we're going to be really tough on this. Maybe the delivery of that, the rollout of that isn't quite as much as what it was, as much as the threat of it was. And maybe that's the case with these tariffs.
Well, you have, I think, the case that what President Trump understands very clearly is the power of the United States economically, internationally, and even with our closest partners. And what we've seen is he's willing to kind of utilize that leverage, even with, our quote unquote friends, to the north and to the south, Canada and Mexico, with a little bit more of a hammer than he is with a carrot, right? And those countries, even though it's uncomfortable for them, and they, kind of outwardly and externally, it's very much, they're pushing back on those things as one would expect of what the president is saying. But internally, they really have to do some soul searching because the economic power and leverage of the United States is irreplaceable, particularly when you're talking about Canada and Mexico, and even countries in Asia as well as in Europe, and we've seen that in South America as well, in other situations where you know um, there's been some a little bit more heated rhetoric from foreign foreign executives and foreign leaders and that type of thing. But then behind the scenes, really they realize, hey, we've got to figure out a way to solve this because we cannot keep doing this long term. And I think President Trump understands the fact that he has quite a bit more leverage and is capable of putting in place some of the policies that he thinks is going to put the United States back on a better economic footing.
And then Tal, to you, I mean, I know that Canada was supposed to have elections anyway coming up in the next several months. They could possibly be delayed based on this economic policy. Canada has a weird way of doing their elections. Let's just put that out there too. But we had known for some time that Trudeau was probably going to be out at some point, and we knew the elections were going to happen. And Canadians in power there, the Liberal Party, were worried about a potential landslide for conservatives and potential change in the party for who represents the country. How important is it for Trump? Same question to Tim, with to have that hammer relationship with Carney coming in and putting him right on the back seat, just as elections could be popping up on his end too.
Yeah, well, Will, I mean, it's been at least weeks since you've been in college, so let me make sure this example, okay, make sure the example makes sense. So, in some sense, I feel like the United States is the wealthy, unattractive friend that brings a keg to the party at like 1:30 a.m., right? So, like, we're just kind of everyone likes to have us around. All the girls have gone home, but we're like still willing to fund the party for all of our kind of lazy friends. So that's what's being called into question, right? There our friends, our neighbors, whether it's Canada or Mexico, have benefited from our tremendous investment of taxpayer money to stave off, other countries that would look to deposition North America, right? That's being called into question, and it seems that President Trump and this administration is now showing up with a bill, right? That's uncomfortable, it's provocative, but again, we'll see what the American people, if it really lands with them, they're probably wondering why we're, again, subsidizing our neighbors' national security beyond our own. The question of Trump specifically, um, I mean, the what's interesting about what's happening in Canada is it's another example of the timing of politics being so important, right? So the depths of popularity for the prime minister may have just come a little early, and now there's going to be just a they're going to put a mask on the new guy and kind of forget everything that Trudeau was working on for the months leading up to the depth of his unpopularity, right? So because of their flexibility around when they can call elections, enough time may have passed, and the United States may have been provocative enough that now, as a country, they're going to want to not change horses midstream. I mean, they're talking about this trade war like an actual war in their own country, right? So that does provide, I think, some cover for the folks that are currently in charge, and maybe what prevents conservatives from taking over government in Canada.
I don't know what you're talking about. I was reading. I was a very scholarly person staying up at the libraries that late. I was reading about the history of St. Patrick
Oh,
on
there
those
you
days.
go.
I
Good,
bet.
Yes.
good.
So I wasn't, yeah. But now, well, I'll leave it there.
Yeah,
But the,
you're an old soul, Will. That's what.
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
I'm old soul. Thinking about, I guess, more ahead of time into 2026, there's a governor's race. We have perhaps the most vocal, although you know what, Chad Bianco is pretty vocal too. But we have one of the more vocal candidates that has jumped into this race with Katie Porter. Chad Bianco, who's the Republican, he's a sheriff, is in this race as well. Katie Porter making kind of a splash last week, saying in her campaign video she'll go toe to toe with anyone, which would seem to suggest former Vice President Harris, should she decide to jump into the race for California governor. And then you also have about half of Governor Newsom, anyone who's shaking hands with Governor Newsom in Sacramento, half of them are in are in this race too, as well as former Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa. Tim, your thoughts on Katie Porter jumping in, and then maybe the rest of the field too?
Well, I mean, Katie Porter, we all knew was going to jump in. She's got tremendous fundraising capability. She certainly is a darling of the far left, and that's something that I think is scary, not only to those who kind of are on the more centrist side of the Democratic Party, but certainly Republicans and then the business community and just a lot of different interests in California. I'm not surprised at the language that she would, hey, take on, go toe to toe with anybody. I mean, it's baseball spring training time. It's kind of a brushback pitch, but from her saying that to Kamala Harris, I mean, I think that everybody looking at this race with any kind of reality understands the fact that, that Kamala Harris is absolutely in the driver's seat. If she jumps in this race, it completely changes the dynamic. Now, the question would be, California has the top two, so the top two vote getters are the ones who, go on from the primary to the general election. So if you have a whole bunch of Democrats, and one maybe two Republicans, if that, well, okay, math tells you that it'll be a Republican and Democrat, or even one Republican. But if you have a whole bunch of Republicans and maybe just the Democratic field whittles down a little bit more, where you maybe have really only two or three viable Democrats, well, you could see a top two, Democrat versus Democrat election. I do think, though, that the likelihood is that if Kamala Harris does get in, she, certainly is the odds-on favorite from the Democratic side. And if the Republicans can stay, I think, organized and disciplined and have, one or maybe two good candidates, that's going to be really the matchup we'll see in November of 2026.
And then Tal, is there a lane for somebody who's a second Democrat to get to a top two? I mean, we've really seen Republicans perform well in House races. They performed pretty well in a number of state legislative races as well in these last recent election, this last election cycle of 2024. Basically, I think the question I'm trying to ask is Antonio Villaraigosa as somebody who is, I think, trying to position himself in a much different way than the rest of the Democrats in California. I think he wants to harp on his Central Valley ties as well. Is he a really viable candidate, especially to communities of Hispanic Americans in California that have moved away from the Democratic Party, but still maybe don't want to go towards someone like Chad Bianco, or maybe another Republican that may be more considered a standard print Republican in this cycle. Is this a good lane for Villaraigosa to run? And can Katie Porter gain anyone too from at times a populist message?
Having worked for Congressman Valadao for a number of years, I never assume anymore that Hispanic voters are going to support in large numbers a candidate simply because they're Hispanic, right? It's a different group. I think there's a lot of sort of variation between folks that are relatively new to this country, to the folks who've been here for many generations. So I wouldn't consider that group as a sort of block. And I think I don't know that that's necessarily helpful to former Mayor Villaraigosa, although I think he says a lot of the right things. For a Democrat, he certainly comes across as generally more pro-business than you would expect from other candidates. The Katie Porter issue specifically is really interesting because some of what Katie Porter's talked about is not, I mean, she would hate to admit this, but is not unlike what some of the rhetoric that's coming out of the Trump administration, right? So kind of calling into question tax treatment, more of almost a populist movement. That was kind of her shtick, was to put the whiteboard up in the committee hearings and talk, browbeat CEOs of big companies and things like that. There's actually echoes of that are happening nationally on the same topic that we were discussing related to trade. So a great way to put a death nail in any Democratic campaign would have any sort of alignment with the current administration in Washington, D.C. That being said, I do think there's interest in those issues and this sort of populist rhetoric that I do think was driving in certain communities support moving towards President Trump this last election cycle. The government's not looking out for you. There are other folks making lots of money and you're not. You've been left behind. There's a lot of similarities in that rhetoric and what we saw out of Congresswoman Porter when she was in the House, right? So I think that would be the lane. The challenge, and I think Tim made reference to this, is that we're such a big state. The amount of money you need to educate people, to educate voters simply who you are, that's going to be the advantage that Vice President Harris has, is that she's got whatever, effectively 100% name ID. A lot of it's bad, but if you're some former member of Congress from Orange County, you've got a lot of ground to cover to even be in the conversation as a statewide candidate. And I don't know where Congresswoman Porter pulls that money from, right? Where does she get those resources? It probably won't be industry. where does it come from that she can introduce herself to, whatever 35 million people across the state of California?
You know, as touting the old Iowa thing, she is, I mean, and that's where she's from. She is totally an Iowa candidate in the old Iowa Democratic Party of old, where it was, just going to go in there. I'm going to tell you how it is. You might
Mhm.
not agree with me. I'm sure I must imagine how your conversations, and I know Representative Valdez talked about his conversations with Tom Vilsack, running agriculture, that's not always, it's not always a generous conversation, but it's one where I don't think that there's any you don't not know where people stand in a conversation like that. I think then that's the question that you pose there too. Does that work here, and does that work if there's not too many lanes to run out of? And if you just have a number of Republicans that are just generally upset in California, if that's most of your Republican vote, that's 27% to a right-leaning candidate, and then that makes it harder for those other people to
Yeah.
probably find that lane. Last questions for you guys, Tim. If you had to pick at this time, top two in the field, who would it be? And let's even throw in the hypothetical that Kamala's in there. I imagine that's probably number one.
Well, if you're looking at the field as it sits today, you're going to have, a Vice President Kamala Harris is the top, Democrat, provided she announces, and the Republican would be Chad Bianco would be top two of both of them, given what the lineup is today, and anticipating that Vice President Harris jumps in the race.
Cal, same question to you. Is that where you're kind of looking at the moment?
Yeah, I'd say Vice President Harris. Then I'm going to kind of do an unknown category that I think we end up getting some version of a California President Trump. So someone who's independently wealthy, maybe they're not even a registered Republican, but that they take on that sort of mantra of a business person who can solve the problems that others haven't, and a sort of non-politician. I think that's actually who, I don't think we even know who they are yet, but I could see that person popping up and stroking a big check to introduce themselves to voters. And there's been a lot of times that's failed miserably, by the way, for candidates in California, but I think we're going to get one of those as we have in other cycles.
I'll just ask one quick follow-up. It's for Tim on this. I know that you had supported John Cox in the past, or you had worked behind the scenes with him. Would his candidacy make more sense nowadays, or somebody like that Tal's mentioning to gain a higher percentage of the vote than maybe it would have in 2018?
Yeah, I ran his race in 2018, and but did not do the recall. Um, I think it depends in that it depends on how much money a candidate is willing to put in order to communicate and make themselves known to California voters. And it is a lot of money. I mean, we're talking real money that individuals who, have wealth, would have to part with. And one of the old sayings about, getting wealthy is you don't get wealthy by giving away your money. And we've seen that example as Tal noted in the past with individuals like Meg Whitman. And just because you spend, over $100 million of money does not guarantee that you're going to win the governor's race. So it's very, very high stakes gambling. And I think that it certainly gives you an advantage, but it, only gets you part of the way.
All right, still as as we're noting, still a year and what, 3 months
Yeah.
till we get to a primary, so a lot of time for people to jump in. Thank you guys both so much. Happy St. Patrick's Day, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Same to
Cool.
you.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.